The first book of Achee, an account of the love of the earth and the righteousness for Messiah. The words of Goker Harum, an account of the vision of Achee, as seen by Goker Harum III, concerning the first great war in heaven. Now behold, listen and learn a great mystery of life. You'll learn how to determine a godly lifestyle and a clean heart. Those of you who are in the midst of a wicked world, awake, and behold the knowledge of God in the last days, and be empowered over sin, and be endowed unto righteousness and oneness with God in your daily walk. Search out these things, for they have been hidden from you, but now they come before your eyes. And those who desire to serve God and have groped to find a way have come upon a blessing from the hand of God. And it came to pass that I sat before the Urim, and I looked, and I saw a sun-bathed gentle hillside. And as I looked about to see, I realized I was seeing where Adam and Eve dwelt in Eden. And Eve was sitting on a rock with her feet in clear water. And it came to pass that a falling star streaked across the heavens, and it lit up the evening bright as day. And the meteorite landed with a crash, and the smoke of burning, near to the place where Eve was. And Eve was frightened, and with a shriek she fled from before it. And it came to pass that I looked, and I beheld the iridescent rock stranger in the middle of the hillside, with a skid mark and small crater from its landing. Now as I beheld, a strange thing happened. I began to hear the thoughts and feel the feelings of the things in the scene through the eyes of God, and their private feelings in speech, one with the other, were made known to me. And I was amazed. For here in the midst of the presence of the Holy Great One in Elda were rocks and clumps of grass and flowers and bushes scattered about, with the dark multicolored iridescent rock in the middle. And they all knew each other, but the meteorite was a stranger, and the wind and the hill and the stream conversed amongst themselves. But the rock lay silently, dazed at the sudden change that had come upon him, and he intruded upon them, and they felt the violence of his arrival. And all that were quiet in his presence, and they held their peace. And it came to pass that as new days dawned, all could behold his many colors as they shone forth from him and changed with the movement of the light of God. And after a while, the rock stranger spoke to all of them. And I could feel that in his heart he felt unsure of himself, and he felt a little afraid and insecure by his travels suddenly coming to an end, as he burst forth into a world that was unknown to him. And I beheld as he felt inferior, and he spoke with a bluffing tone, and he said, I am better than all of you. I am a traveler, and I have wandered the far reaches of creation, and my name is Semyaza, which means my name has seen. For I have seen the wonders that lie beyond. But who are you? You have always lain here upon this hillside. My mother is a comet, and she travels whithersoever she chooses, and has no fixed course like the lowly sun and stars and heavenly bodies. I am beautiful and multicolored, with iridescence, but you are just plain old brown and gray rocks, and your mother is an old broken down mountain. And it came to pass that all those that were before him were ashamed at his haughtiness, and they were ashamed before the presence of the Holy Great One. And at the first they had legs, they would have fled before him, as Eve did. But as time passed, some of the younger rocks began to desire to hear of the wonders of his travels, and they were attracted to his talk and desired to be associated with his presence. And it came to pass that the wind began to bear the message and to send the news abroad that in the midst of Eden, in the presence of God, there was one who would compare the place of value and worth above one another. And all creation in Eden for the first time was introduced to the sin of superiority and of judgment. Of value was being thrust upon all living souls, and thus the seeds of racism, war, and death beginning to be sown. And all who did not pay him heed to listen and partake of his haughtiness were pure and holy, and they stood firm with the vision of their created purpose. But some rocks began to relent, and they began to desire to listen to the rock stranger and his rebellion against God. And the thing greatly troubled all of Eden, for it was known to them that every hill and every tree and every stream and every rock were created by the loving hand of the Son of God, to be a marvelous work and a wonder in his sight. And he did not divide his love, insomuch that he would love one above another. But Semyaza rebelled, and would that he could pretend to hide the oneness of God. Now understand that what passed between all these before me were not words that were familiar with man in his temporal state, but they spoke to one another by the power of the feelings of their hearts, that resulted in them receiving life in the day of their creation. And it came to pass that in time some of the rocks believed Semyaza and were influenced by him, and began to feel ashamed of their mothers, and began to view their lives as dull and of no value compared to this strange multicolored traveler. And those who were drawn to him began to ask him to rehearse the wonders of his travels to them, and they began to hold him up as the most important rock upon the hillside, or even in all the regions round about. And it came to pass that those he confided in listened to the grand adventures he told, and began to feel superior to all those around them that chose not to pay him heed. And in the course of those days, they became dissatisfied with their visions of their created purpose. And Semyaza said to a rock beside him, "How are you called, little one?" And he answered, "My name is Artagoth, which means the earth is power, and all things are created by the power of the love of God in the earth." And Semyaza replied, "Oh no, that will never do. You are copper, and you were created to rule over all the host of men, and you can be great in the sight of all of the earth, for you shall bring them pleasure and power and abundance, and they will greatly desire you and worship you. And in this thing, the love of God is done away. And in this manner did Semyaza give all who would listen lying visions. And he prospered and practiced in the midst of the holy garden of Eden and in the sight of God. And it came to pass that after Semyaza began to corrupt the visions of any who would listen, that Eve came upon the scene, for she had become frightened when Semyaza had landed, and she had not come this way for some time. And as Eve walked some distance away from all this, she heard the rocks talking about the stranger, and she felt a division between them. Some were drawn to Semyaza, and some were repulsed by his rebellions against God. And they loved God, and they would not displease him. And as Eve drew near, she felt as she must choose between them. Finally, after a time, she felt curious, and went meekly and shyly up to a bush, and peeked around it at the stranger, and he was beautiful. She had never seen an iridescent rock like him before, and he was exotic to his surroundings, and he talked and acted like he was from a far away, where Eve had never been. No mountain had any rock like him. And Eve listened as Semyaza told his stories of grandeur, and she felt drawn to him because he was from far away, and he was beautiful. These two feelings have never entered the heart of Adam before, and his rib was created to be the feelings of his heart made flesh, and she was afraid, for she felt a part of herself become a stranger to her husband. And as it happened, Adam began to notice that all the rocks were not acting towards Eve as they had before. Some were quiet around her, and in his heart he began to sense a division among them and between himself and Eve. And this was a new and very alien feeling, never before to confront him, and he was troubled. And it came to pass that Adam told Eve never to visit the rock stranger again. And he said, "I sense a division, and the thing shall surely displease God." And the rocks among the Erkadoshi, upon hearing Adam, who was made in the image of God, began to greatly be ashamed. And they were thus the first in the earth to cry out for a Redeemer, and they wept and cried out for one who could deliver them from their shame. For it was one in their midst, even one of their own kind, that had first dishonored the love of God, and brought a division into the abode of God. And from that day the rocks of the Erkadershi have ceased not to cry out continually before the face of the great Holy One, for one who will redeem them and erase their stain and pollution in the midst of the paradise of God. And Abel was the first to bring their voices unto the ears of God, requesting him to bring salvation. And they cried, God, come and save us, for our shame is too great to bear. Why, O God, did it have to be one of our kind who brought this great dishonor upon us in your sight? And God said, I will have a son, and by his hand I will send Michael, who is one anointed to save you. For there is coming a great war in heaven. And it came to pass that Semyaza began to be lifted up in his own eyes, and he took great delight in the pleasure of his own glory. And he prophesied and said, I shall be a many-named one, yeah, even as the Son of God. And in the course of the earth he indeed came to have many names to describe his filthiness. For he is called Semyaza, Satan, Belial, Phosphor, Beelzebub, Prince of Darkness, and Melchizedek. And he began to fight against God, insomuch that he took it upon himself to reveal a vision of his own glory to any of the watchers that would listen. And he would proclaim with great and swelling acclamations that the visions of created purpose given by God to some watchers were unsatisfactory. And he would lie and invent for them a vision of self-glory. Now the Lord God, when he created all things, he seen that all things were good, and Semyaza had been created with a good and wonderful vision, and his vision of created purpose was for him to see the glory of God as it fills the immensity of creation, and to be the herald of the preeminence and legitimacy of the word of his power, because Messiah is indeed what his name has seen. But this watcher rejected this great vision, and he would not honor the word of his power, and he invented a lie to replace it. And he now claimed to be the herald of the power of the legitimacy over the world of pleasure. And it came to pass that one by one he began to replace the visions of any who would listen to his lies. And thus he became known as the father of lies. Now the Lord God had asked Adam and Eve to dress the garden and to keep it, And Adam often spoke to the Erkadershi, and he besought them to remain faithful to God in all their doings. And it came to pass that one day Eve approached a part of Eden where she had not been, and she came upon a serpent that was many colored and iridescent, and had an appearance much like Semyaza. And she had been obedient to the will of God, and had obeyed Adam, and did not visit the rock stranger anymore. But a subtle change had occurred in her heart, and she found she could be attracted for the first time to something for how it looked, and because it felt like it was from far away. And since she had peeked at Semyaza, she had this change in her heart, and it stayed with her. Now the serpent, whose name was Nakash, which means to diligently observe to see that the will of God is done, was a good and holy watcher among the Erkadoshi, and it was gentle and harmless, and it had legs. But when Eve saw and loved Nakash, these two subtle pollutants were in her heart. For Nakash was like unto Semyaza in his appearance, and Eve in her heart innocently felt drawn in her love for Nakash to him because he was beautiful to look upon, and because he was exotic to her. And she was accustomed to seeing one after his manner, and because Eve associated Nakash in her heart with Semyaza, Semyaza was able to speak to her by the mouth of the serpent with subtleties. And Semyaza said, God knows you will not fail, but your eyes shall be opened, and you will become like unto him, to know good and evil. For he wants you not to partake of it, so he can remain superior to you. And it came to pass that in her heart Eve could feel the spirit that gave the life to the cedar tree. And she felt sad in her heart that she had fallen short in the eyes of God. And when she felt the tree, she exclaimed with delight, for it did feel all the good in her heart that the great Holy One had put there. Wherefore she went into the feelings of the tree, and filled herself with the knowledge of the goodness that was in her by the hand of God in her creation. And the feelings of the tree seemed to take away her sorrow, that she had fallen short in the eyes of God, and it seemed delightful to her. And she went and brought Adam, and she said, My husband, this tree feels all the good the Lord God has put into you in the day he created you. And if we partake of it, we can feel like we are as good as God, as good as God. And Adam said, I know God has forbidden us to partake of the feelings of this tree. And he was greatly saddened, for he felt a gulf arising up between him and his rib, and his great loneliness began to come once again upon him, and in his heart he cried out for the fear of the loneliness. And they both partook of the feelings of the tree, and she partook so she could become as good as God, and he partook for his fear of loneliness. And it came to pass that when they had partaken of the tree, the eyes of them were both opened, and they beheld that they had been lied to, and have responded to the lie, and I am doing so. And in doing so, they were now not like God, but were strangers to him. And when these things transpired, it was a very sober day in Eden. For the object of creation, yea, even that which was made in the image of God, by acknowledging Semyaza to obey him, and in this way the very image of God took upon themselves a portion of one who was rebellious toward God. And again, in this way the power of Semyaza arose greatly, for now his soul was become the element of wickedness, and he was recognized by the image of God to be an alternative to God himself. And all the lying visions of those who followed after him were thus affirmed. But our first parents acted inadvertently, and the glory of Semyaza would be short-lived, as Adam and Eve did sin no more after their baptisms of purification. And it came to pass that in the course of time there arose up one who empowered Semyaza to fully be the opponent of God, and to have power to wage war against his purposes. And that man was Cain. And while the sins of the first parents were inadvertent, the sins of Cain were the intervention of his agency to establish and call forth by the use of the element of wickedness that Semyaza would be the god of his religion and the occult, and Cain ruled over Semyaza, and they entered into a pact in sorcery that Cain would establish Semyaza if he could gain the desires of his heart over his brother Abel. And it came to pass that Azazel, who is one of the Derkadochi, and is inscribed 10th by his cunning, opened up to Cain the manner by which it could be accomplished that he could kill his brother without drawing near to him. And thus this thing would not be known, and the guilt of Cain would not come forth, and the thing would be kept secret in the midst of the earth. And it came to pass that Cain prayed evil and hateful prayers, and he used the altar of his father, and he used Azazel as the element of wickedness to call for the death unto Abel. And it came to pass that a stone of Azazel smote Abel, insomuch that he died, and Cain had not come near to Abel, and done nothing but to pray his hateful prayers against him. And a falling star fell upon Abel, and smote him, that he died. And Cain knew he could say the thing had occurred, but not by his hand. But Semyaza had deceived Cain, for he had not revealed unto Cain that the thing could not be hidden from God. And Cain was called to account before him. And thus it was established by the intervention of agency that Semyaza and his religion will be the enemies to all things good and the worship of God in heaven. And in the end, as Cain killed with a rock, he was also killed by a rock, when the earth shook and his house fell upon him. And in this event happened in the year that Adam returned to Eden, and the shaking of the earth was caused by the Erkadershi, and their rejoicing over the return of Adam to his natural home. And it came to pass that the war increased, and it grew, as there were many evil men who put their hand to the task of affirming the lying visions of Semyaza and his band, and it grew until Semyaza took with him 1/3 of the host of heaven, and even to the number of the 200 watchers who rebelled to follow after him. And it came to pass that one arose who was a descendant of Cain, and his name was Lamech, which means to be instructed by darkness. And Lamech received instructions by the hand of the Derkadershi, starting with Semyaza himself. And Semyaza desired to beget children, and he chose Lamech, for Lamech had 2 wives. And he followed after the manner of the religion of Cain, and he was the first to enter into wickedness of having more than 1 wife. And Semyaza instructed Lamech that by the use of the element of wickedness, and by the using of a meteorite, and by the drinking of menstrual blood, could conceive a child that was given by the power of the intervention of his agency, a lying vision according to the choosing of Semyaza. And it came to pass that Lamech entered into a pact with Semyaza, and he performed and he practiced, and a child was indeed conceived that was evil by its nature, and had a vision of wickedness that was given him by Semyaza. And the child was cruel and had no remorse of conscience, and his mother was ashamed, and she feared that the knowledge of his conception would come to the people. And the other wife was jealous, and she began to noise abroad how this thing was accomplished. And it came to pass that Lamech began to fear that his secret would become known, and all the neighbors would rise up against him. And he rose up and he slew the child in his 14th year. And the shame rose upon Lamech in abundance, for he had murdered to get gain, but for the sake of the oath with Semyaza, and the dominion of Semyaza increased. For once the manner of the evil of Lamech was known, there were many who entered into accomplish having children for the Derkadershi. And it came to pass that these children of a Derkadershi, who were called the Nephilim, spread violence and great pollutance across the face of the earth, and the war waxed great. And it was in its height at the time of the birth of Enoch, the 7th from Adam. And the land was filled with the visions of the glory of Semyaza, and with sorcery, and with witchcraft, and every kind of evil. And every man sought to take advantage of his neighbor. Now the doings of the Nephilim were after this manner. In the days of the Nephilim, who were called giants, all the earth was filled with havoc, and one village of people village of people who hate one another, they would choose from one among them a most wicked and powerful sorcerer, and they would join to conceive a child by the use of the element of wickedness, who would have powers to destroy that which sustained or protected their neighbors. In this way, the evil vision of their Nephilim would be as a weapon against their fellows. Then their enemies would in turn make an effort to conceive a child more powerful than they, and thus every man against his neighbor. The whole earth was filled with the violence. If hunters were fighting against fishermen, the Nephilim which they begat would curse and kill and devour the fish and the sorcery and witchcraft, insomuch that the fishermen would perish for want of fish to eat. The hunters would gain power over them, and the children of the waters began to sin against animals, birds, and the fish of the sea. And it came to pass in the space of the 10 generations, the peoples of the earth became ripe in iniquity by the hand of the Decadershi, and for as the Decadershi went forth in their wickedness, they did so without meeting any resistance, and they prospered and practiced at their will, because their kind heart of God in his purity made no allowance against evil, nor did he bring to mind not but his great delight in his love for his creation, in their visions and in their grandeur of his love for them. You will see that the great and holy men and their ribs took the side of God and set their hand against the Decadershi and Semyaza, and Enoch walked with God and was a mighty one to lay the foundation of their obedience to the will of the Messiah. And Noah besought God in behalf of all the families of the earth, and in this way brought forth the flood, and he enabled the great Holy One to subdue those fallen from their first estate, and bury them in the earth out of sight. And thus when they were bound and reeling from the blow of the flood, the great man Shem established the covenant with all the Erkadershi, which is called Shabua, and in this way built into all the holy ones of heaven who dwell among men upon the earth a resistance to evil and corruption. And thus we see that it is by the hand of the holy order of the priesthood that was after the manner of Melchizedek that the intervention of the just began to turn the war against the Decadershi, and the brother of Jared was such a one. Now after I beheld all these things before the I was astonished, and I walked with amazement for the space of 232 days before I approached to use the and Thummim again, for I was very desirous to understand all these things, and the Lord brought to prepare my soul for this work.